Well, it's a pleasure and honor to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. My talk will not involve slides. It is what I would call...
Is that better?
That's better.
Okay.
Thank you. It's what I would call low tech. I'll be speaking directly to you, and I'll apologize for looking down here and there in order to frame the talk. My talk is about the unending legacies of eugenics, white supremacy, the ecosystems that bind them together. And so let me start with thinking about the lottery. The Lottery is a short story that describes a fictional, bucolic small town in the United States. The townspeople seem lovely and perhaps even thoughtful about each other until once per year when their cleansing happens. This is when they stone a member of their community to death. The decision as to who is stoned is rather arbitrary, not based on crime, harm to another, past misdeeds, current troubles, or threats of future harm. No, it's the random black dot on a piece of paper that seals Tessie Hutchinson's fate. No part of the lottery should make sense, even though the townspeople at some point believed that stoning a member of their community each year would contribute to a strong harvest. Surely at some point, the illogic of this should slip away. Even if killing a mother, son, or daughter brings a strong corn crop, is the corn yield worth it? Apparently, some think so. They think so. As Jackson writes, the people had done it so many times that they only half listened to the directions. Most of them were quiet, wetting their lips, not looking around. Everyone participates, even the small children. One child, little Davy Hutchinson, is given a few pebbles. Barely aware of life itself, the little boy will become complicit in a practice laid out before him. He too will take part in the process that ends in his mother's death. He, like the town's other children, are predestined to believe the lottery is the natural order of things. The child will learn to smell the stench of fear in the air, taste the anxious sweat that drips from his brow on his lip, as he one day will choose a stone. This will become familiar, selecting the scapegoat on which to direct his anger, fear, and hope will be normal. This is the social order. The lottery does not simply choose its victims, it predestines the entitled. It protects this way of life. That is, in 2020, it also became unquestionably apparent that the pandemic was not all that ails us around the world, not all that ails us in the United States. And I apologize for the US navel gazing on eugenics, but I do want to center a US story. Systemic racism, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness crystallized in the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, an unarmed jogger stalked and killed by Gregory and Travis McMichael in a rural Georgia town, Breonna Taylor, an essential health care provider, fatally shot by several Louisiana, Kentucky police officers, and George Floyd, lynched in daylight as a Minneapolis, Minnesota officer straddled his neck, pressing a knee onto it for nearly 9 minutes as crowds gasped and watched in horror. Weeks later, Jacob Blake, an unarmed father and Black, would be shot 7 times in close range while his children watched in Kenosha, Wisconsin, all in 2020. What exactly do these fractures reveal about eugenics, society, and law in the United States? Is there a descriptive story to tell with a normative analog? If so, what can we learn from it? Are there lessons for the present to be derived from attention to the past? Has the strange promise of a post-racial, post-eugenics world, or just the United States, materialized after a 2-term presidency of Barack Obama, likely not with the rise of the president Donald Trump, who expressed vibrant forms of racism. 2020 beckoned for truth, reckoning, and reconciliation. The strange confluence of events in 2020 urges an urgent and acknowledgement of an origin story that places slavery, Jim Crow, and contemporary racism in proper discussion with eugenics and context alongside the more proper traditional American narratives that center a revolutionary spirit of white Americans who fought against the British to stake a claim for their equality and dignity. Long divorced from that historical, political, and legal discourse is acknowledgement of the purposeful and enduring harms cast upon indigenous people, Black Americans, and other people of color to justify colonialism, the capitalism derived by slavery, and the post-Reconstruction era of scapegoating the newly freed. In other words, there are racialized traumas and terrorism yet to fully be accounted for in the stories that we tell ourselves, and even about eugenics. For example, from a historical perspective, what message must people tell themselves to justify the intergenerational kidnapping and trafficking of children, women, and men across international borders and throughout the United States? How does a society come to tolerate children on the auction block, bid upon as if they were field chattel? What narratives must the auctioneers tell to encourage bidders to secure a lucrative offer for the traders in human flesh? How do individuals, come to justify their participation in this cruel enterprise, including enslaving, renting, leasing, and selling their own offspring, born from frequent, though unacknowledged, debasement of enslaved women? How has the failure to acknowledge and address the carnage and prurience of America's eugenic story, its racial origin story, impacted life today? What social conditioning made possible the separate and unequal society of the 20th century that bleeds into the 21st century? A nation marked by white Christians bombing Black Christian churches and the homes of Black ministers and clergy. What lives in the soul of a nation to justify school segregation, housing segregation, and voter suppression? The heavy iron shackles that controlled the movements of enslaved Blacks were replaced when freedom was granted, that is, by invisible chains and restraints that demarcated social and legal hierarchies protected by law. Today, what makes possible a police officer's strangulation of an unarmed Black man while colleagues look on? What makes that possible? In short, 150 years after the abolition of American slavery, the stain and vestiges of eugenics and slavery remain in the United States. My talk addresses only a thin slice of this story. And it's a story, pardon me, let me get some water. Would you please? And thank you. I just arrived today, just a little bit ago. Give me just one moment. Thank you. This is lovely. I'm getting water from all directions. It's fabulous. I'll take that too. When this one runs out, I'll have that one. Absolutely. We'll need it for this talk. Okay, thank you so much. The racial caste system is an ecosystem founded on legal and social tenets of racial hierarchy and dominance, a belief in white supremacy and inferiority of people of color. But it is important to know that white supremacy is practiced within the context of whiteness as well. That's how we get eugenics itself. At the turn of the 20th century in the United States, there were 36 different categories of whiteness. And what has been ignored in history are those 36 different categories of whiteness, which leads to Carrie Buck in 1927 being coercively, forcibly sterilized against her will because she's part of the doomed white race, the white race that in the United States the effort was to do away with, to get rid of. And it's important that we acknowledge and tell that story to complicate the narrative of what white supremacy is. White supremacy wasn't just sort of directing its efforts against indigenous people, against black peoples. White supremacy was also seeking to eradicate, get rid of poor white people who were perceived to be or have disabilities, poor white people whom you just heard in the discourse about, air quote, feeble-minded, poor white people who were vagrants, poor white people for whom, and this is why slavery is so important, and the American story is important, which is very different than how slavery took its way through the UK and other places, because slavery was domestic, folks living in and amongst themselves. And poor white people were a tool of slavery. After slavery's abolition, they no longer serve the purpose of being the tool of policing black people, which was significantly what poor white people did. They were a tool during slavery. After slavery's over, they have very little use for white elites. And we could talk more about that. Placed in proper context, the American commitment, addiction to its racial ideology of a caste system should be understood as an uninterrupted continuum since the earliest Europeans and later US ships arrived on the North American shores carrying cargo of kidnapped and trafficked Africans. Isabel Wilkerson now adds to this canon of thought on the American caste system in her book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, contributing in popular form to the academic and scholarly accounts of race, caste, and enduring hierarchy and white supremacy in the United States. Racial hierarchy has long been the euphemistic elephant in the room and the American dividing line, demarking power, freedom, and self-governance. To properly undertake the examination of racial caste in the United States requires engaging beyond law, reaching to the fields and tools of sociology, ethnography, and anthropology to unpack not only law's racial trap, undisguised by legislation such as the Fugitive Slave Acts, or myriad cases, but also the lasting, even haunting social, cultural, and rhetorical norms and mores. Essential to any caste is the establishment of rank and order among the people stratified. In the United States, this took the form of establishing white supremacy through law, whereby whiteness accorded privileges and rights not available to black people, most apparently, but far from exclusively, freedom and citizenship. In several distinct ways, law served as a vital purpose in creating racial caste and hierarchy and eugenics. Law undergirded and legalized the lucrative enterprise of American chattel slavery. That is, law in the United States set the conditions that kidnapped and trafficked human chattel from Africa would never or rarely rise above their legally designated subordinated status. And let me explain the categories from which this emerged. First, there was matrilinealty. This designated that all children born of enslaved women would by law inherit the status of their mother. This proved important in denying the multiracial offspring of white plantation owners independence and freedom. Second, rules of hypodescent mandated that anyone with any African biological heritage would always be legally designated as Black and therefore legally, by law, inferior. Third, legal provisions would provide another guardrail against the infiltration of whiteness, the preserving of the racial order through marriage, namely anti-miscegenation laws. The point that I'm building here is that as we think about eugenics, it has a legal foundation that keeps it alive. Rather than law serving to dismantle it, law serves to establish it and to preserve it. Fourth, 20th century legal movement eugenics would protect the racial caste system from white people unfit for whiteness. And so let me walk my way through these categories. Matrilineality. First, given widespread sexual predation against enslaved Black women, the initial laws creating the racial caste system related to exactly this. Sexual violence against Black women and girls was rampant in slave-holding families, even if rendered invisible by historians. Researchers of human genetics offer a sobering account of this. Rapes against Black women by white men were so common in the United States that white men contributed 3 times more to the modern-day gene pool of people of African descent than European women did. Thus, establishing whether offspring of a white man and enslaved Black woman was free or enslaved as a matter, the earliest American laws made it absolutely clear that those offspring would take on the status of their mothers. So the earliest of American laws, which we could call eugenics laws, were the laws that established that white men's children would never be able to reach whiteness, that they would always be legally Black. And to be legally Black in the United States meant being legally the status of chattel. Now, what was the legal status of chattel in the United States? That was the cow in the field. That was the mule, that was the donkey, that was whatever animal was kept in the barn. This is not just my making of these things. This is exactly how US senators described Black people. But it's important to understand that this was part of the earliest laws of the United States establishing this, so that our time frame shouldn't be thinking about Carrie Buck, 1927. Instead, we should be thinking about the 1600s and this being established in law. Next is to think about hypodescent. The second means of ordering America's racial caste system was establishing these laws of hypodescent. This was essentially what you've probably come to know as the one-drop rule. Such laws mandated that any African ancestry defined a person as Negro or colored, each of these terms signifying those who would today be referred to as Black. Hypodescent aided in establishing and furthering Black second-class citizenship under law. Even more, hypodescent or one-drop codes bolstered another element of the racial caste system and white supremacy. By law, one could not exit out of what was legally a low status of Blackness, even after multiple generations. And these laws mattered. These matters were not confined to the dusty archives of the 17th, 18th, or 19th centuries. Let me give you an example. In 1984, lawyers for Susie Gilroy Phipps filed suit on her behalf to change her racial designation of colored or Black to white on her birth certificate. Phipps, the 50-year-old great-great-great-great-granddaughter of an enslaved Black woman and her owner, fit the Louisiana classification of Black, which designated Blackness by, quote, any traceable amount, 1984, a U.S. law said any traceable amount of blackness, which meant that her great, having one black person who was great, was enough for this woman to be designated as black. This meant that even though Phipps was 1/128th black by Louisiana law, she was still legally black. As such, Louisiana classified her as colored on her birth certificate. Now, if this were insignificant, the state would not have actually shown up to defend its law and to keep her cast as black when she sued. But the state showed up, and the state defended its law, claiming that if Ms. Phipps prevailed, the state could be overwhelmed by individuals filing similar claims, forcing the state to oppose each case and undertake genealogical research. Of course, the state could simply have decided not to litigate such cases or not to perform genealogical research on its citizens. Phipps lost her legal battle to have declared this law unconstitutional, which is stunning. In 1984, she lost. As in the case of Miss Phipps, even African descendants fitting the further delineated racial classification of mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, or hexadecaroon, and beyond, you can't even make that up, were denied the racial classification of white and the rights that attended it. Now, for those of you who might wonder, well, why in the world would she sue to become white? One only has to think about the work of Pauli Murray, a name that might not be familiar to many of you. Pauli Murray was, in many ways, a predecessor to someone whom you have heard of, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Everyone in this room probably thinks of her as a feminist icon. But the person that you've not heard of is Pauli Murray, who is a black woman who graduated first in her class, Howard Law School, was at the ACLU before Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and who wrote what Thurgood Marshall called the Bible of the Civil Rights Movement. In her second year of law school, she wrote 2 papers. She preceded Ruth Bader Ginsburg in life and law school by decades. And in her second year of law school, wrote 2 papers. Both of these papers became foundational to how we understand civil liberties and civil rights in the United States today. One of those papers was used to argue Brown v. Board of Education. The other of the papers was used to establish sex equality, which Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually acknowledges her in case filings and briefs later. But why would one want to sue to become white, or to at least exit the category of black? Pauli Murray helps us to understand this in that book that Thurgood Marshall referenced as the Bible of the Civil Rights Movement. It is a book on race laws in the United States, and it's nearly 800 pages, single space, delineating all of the various ways in which black people were kept in their place. To understand eugenics is to understand how states actually passed laws that said if you were black, you could not play checkers in a park. If you were black, you could not go to the local swimming pool. That if you were black, you couldn't play billiards. If you were black, you could not bowl. These were not laws from the 1600s. These were laws that were passed in the 1900s. Thousands and thousands upon them. These laws must be understood as part of the fabrics of eugenical thinking. Now to the third category, anti-miscegenation laws. A third set of laws whereby lawmakers sought to degrade the social and political status of African Americans and support white supremacy can be found in anti-miscegenation laws. By criminalizing and otherwise prohibiting interracial marriage, such as barring the distribution of marriage licenses or solemnization of such unions, legislatures further fortified the racial caste system. Anti-miscegenation laws were broad in scope. In Virginia, it was illegal to leave the state to marry. It was a felony if any white person intermarried with a colored person. and a state provision voided all marriages between a white person and a colored person without any judicial proceeding whatsoever. So as we begin to see the way in which law, first through designating that black children born through slavery would always take on the status of their mother, 2, hypodescent rules, and 3, anti-miscegenation laws, all policed the boundaries of whiteness and were exclusionary. Famously, the case of the Lovings, Mildred and her husband, a 1967 case, struck down anti-miscegenation laws, but it is worth noting that even though the Lovings were successful in dismantling, a couple things are worth noting. Virginia is the state that criminalized, many states did, that prosecuted the Lovings for being married. Virginia is also the state that brings the test case to the United States for eugenics in Buck v. Bell. There's more that could be said about all of this, but I'll move on. One point that I would like to make, though, is that as we see the carpet roll up on anti-miscegenation laws, it wasn't as if states were satisfied with that, though. It was only in 1987 that Mississippi voters voted to repeal, and by a very narrow margin, their 1890 constitutional ban on interracial marriage. It was 1987, and it was by a narrow vote, 52 to 48%. And then the final category is one in which we've talked about throughout the conference today, and that's eugenics. The guarding of racial purity intensified during the post-Reconstruction era in the United States, so much so that it began to impact whether white Americans were permitted to control their reproduction intra-racially. In 1927, more than 20 years after the first eugenic law was enacted in Indiana, the United States Supreme Court issued the landmark decision in Buck v. Bell, upholding the constitutionality of Virginia's Eugenical Sterilization Act. In an 8-1 decision, the court ruled that the law was constitutional. And the court said that the power that the state had to impose inoculation was broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. In a case written by the Chief Justice of the court, Oliver Wendell Holmes, he said it would be strange if the state of Virginia could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for lesser sacrifices, often not felt to be such by those concerned. He said, in order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence, it is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. He said 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And in the wake of the Supreme Court declaring the Virginia eugenics law constitutional, more than 60,000 Americans were convicted of social unfitness and surrendered to public health officials for compulsory sterilization. Eugenics further guarded white racial purity by policing and restricting undesirable white people from continuing their kind. Compulsory sterilization laws reflected the cruel and inhumane lengths to which white elites dared to go in order to refine and preserve whiteness. After all, at the heart of eugenics laws was a political and legal commitment to surveillance, government intrusion, reprisal, and retribution to discourage not only vice, but also sex, single parenting, and reproduction amongst people who were considered socially undesirable. At their core, those policies were rooted in social judgments about the poor and served to further shape social and legal understandings about whiteness and white supremacy. Now, as I begin towards the conclusion of my talk, White supremacy and eugenics in the United States gave way to the creation and preservation of social, political, and legal order based on skin color. And this, as I mentioned before, dates back hundreds of years in the United States. But eugenics policies were not directed at Black people alone. They were also directed at people who were of Asian descent and people who were indigenous. And these boundaries were policed just as vibrantly. And here I'll just talk briefly about a couple of cases that often are overlooked. And they are the Ozawa v. United States case, and then a case called Bagot, United States v. Bagot then. And in both cases, they involved Asian men who sued to become white. And again, why would anybody want to become white? Because you didn't want to live with the cruelties of what it meant to be Black. And in the first case, in 1922, 5 years before Buck v. Bell, the Supreme Court says, the provision is not that Negroes and Indians shall be excluded, but it is in effect that only free white persons shall be included. The intention was to confer the privilege of citizenship upon that class of persons whom the fathers knew as white, and to deny it to all who could not be so classified. And then 1 year later, the court says, when again another Asian man sues to be incorporated into whiteness, like maybe the court got it wrong, maybe the court will reconsider its ways. And the court says, it may be true that the blonde Scandinavian and the brown Hindu have a common ancestor in the dim reaches of antiquity, but the average man knows perfectly well that there are unmistakable and profound differences between them today, and it is not impossible, if that common ancestor could be materialized in the flesh, we should discover that he was himself sufficiently differentiated from both of his descendants to preclude his racial classification with the other, essentially saying that there was no way for people who are Asian but of Indian descent to be included in whiteness. So now let me conclude. To understand where we are today is to think, in my opinion, about the words of Justice Douglas. Much of this talk has been rooted in law. And Justice Douglas was a member of the United States Supreme Court who famously authored the decision in Skinner v. Oklahoma. Skinner v. Oklahoma is a case that comes after Buck v. Bell. Buck v. Bell is never overturned, but Skinner v. Oklahoma is a unanimous decision of the court striking down an Oklahoma law. This Oklahoma law provided for the compulsory sterilization of people who were petty thieves, and it made it was a law that accepted, that is to say, it did not include people who were white-collar criminals. Mr. Skinner himself was a person who had stolen chickens, and according to the Oklahoma law, being a petty thief having stolen chickens meant that he would be sterilized. Explicitly in the law was that if you were a white-collar criminal, this would not be a fate that you would encounter if you were a banker, embezzler, etc. The case was challenged all the way to the Supreme Court, and Justice Douglas wrote the unanimous opinion of the court striking down the law, saying that it was a human right to be able to determine one's own reproductive destiny. It's notable that the court did not overturn Buck v. Bell in that case. But years later, after the civil rights movement, in a concurring decision that involved racial discrimination, Justice Douglas said, cases which have come to the court depict a spectacle of slavery unwilling to die, precisely because they emerged from law itself. Justice Douglas explained, we have seen contrivances by states designed to thwart Black people from voting. Black people have been excluded over and again from juries solely on account of their race. Black people have been forced to sit in segregated seats in courtrooms. Black people have been made to attend segregated and inferior schools. Black people have been denied entrance to colleges or to graduate schools because of their color. Black people have been prosecuted for marrying white people. Black people have been forced to live in segregated residential districts. And residents of white neighborhoods have denied them entrance. Justice Douglas's concurrence revealed the stunning insistence on law itself on the subordination of Black Americans, from being forced to use segregated facilities in going about their daily lives to various other purposeful prohibitions, including exclusions from public parks, public beaches, public libraries. Expressly, the laws underlying the cases to which Justice Douglas referred intended to deny Black Americans the rights and privileges accorded to white Americans. And it is from this that we can think about a eugenics past unwilling to die. Now, in my final words, how does the United States come to engage with its own truth and conciliation regarding racial caste and the mythology of a post-racial America? The first step, which is what I hope my talk today provides, is to make way in the long historical legacy and to plumb the record, which is what I've sought to do in my writings. And during that summer of 2020, streets in Minneapolis, Minnesota burned after the videoed execution of an unarmed Black man who died underneath the weight of an officer's knee on his neck. George Floyd called to his mother, gasped that he could not breathe, and died. The scene was one of spectacle. It was the contemporary analog to James Allen's Without Sanctuary, which exposed lynchings from throughout the United States, captured by 20th century photographers, often memorialized on postcards. Considering the legacies that I've talked about, it is no surprise that a nation with such a grave history of racial violence and antagonism, spanning centuries and baked into law, would wish to forget, to disremember, or to rewrite its troubled past. In fact, mere years after the abolition of slavery, in the thick of states enacting racially restrictive laws and limiting full equality, the Supreme Court claimed that Black people were, quote, running the slavery argument into the ground to make it apply to every act of discrimination which a person could see fit. The Supreme Court said just mere years after slavery's abolition that it was time for Black people to become mere citizens. On the day of Mr. Floyd's death, anyone who witnessed even part of the video received an unwelcomed postcard in their video inbox. It was the powerful reminder of America's racial caste system, no longer depicted in cotton fields, but rather the urban streets of the United States. This postcard shows what is old, the racial caste eugenics system, is new and revitalized. And what is new reflects a history and performance that we have not shaken. Officer Chauvin demonstrated the performance of the racial hierarchy in literal terms, high above and seemingly unmindful about the value of life beneath his knee. Thank you all.